Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're unpacking the incredibly well-documented journey of a working-class couple who got completely swept up by the massive historical currents of the 19th century. You know, often when we study history, we tend to focus on the generals, the presidents, or the wealthy industrialists. But what I absolutely love to do is zoom in on the everyday people, the ones who actually lived through these era-defining shifts. And today, we're following two of those people, Alexander Whittle and Rachel Morley.
What's truly fascinating here is the sheer unstoppable momentum of their story. Just to escape poverty, this family crossed 3 entire continents over just 15 turbulent years. Think about that for a second. They went from the industrial heartland of England all the way down to the fledgling colony of Australia and then finally landed in the totally lawless goldfields of California. It is a stunning, almost unbelievable arc of human experience that very few of their contemporaries could have ever imagined, let alone actually survived. So let's dive into how it all began.
Let's start right at the beginning with Act 1, the smoky mills of Lancashire.
Okay, so picture this. It's the 1820s in the rapidly industrializing mill towns of Lancashire, England. This place was the absolute engine room of Britain's Industrial Revolution. On the left, we've got Alexander. Born in Chorley in 1818, he came from a large, relatively stable family of 12 kids. His dad was an agricultural laborer and gardener, so sure, they were poor, but they had a really solid family structure. But then, on the right, you have Rachel. Born in Bolton-le-Moors in 1819, her start in life was deeply, deeply precarious. She was born as an illegitimate twin. Her mother, Jane, had already been widowed twice before having the twins. And tragically, Jane died when Rachel was only 15. So Rachel was quite literally orphaned into the brutal reality of the Industrial Revolution, right in a place where massive textile mills and dark coal pits completely dominated the landscape.
Their paths finally converged when they got married in February 1840. Now, the details in the marriage records are super interesting. Alexander was listed as a sawyer, basically a craftsman who cut timber, and he actually signed his own name on the register. Rachel, on the other hand, signed with an X. That meant she couldn't write, which honestly was incredibly common for women from her background back then. Oh, and another detail, they actually had their first child, Elizabeth, about 9 months before the wedding even happened. But Alexander's trade as a sawyer, that was a vital, highly sought-after skill, and as we'll see, it perfectly positioned him to ride the massive wave of Britain's colonial expansion.
Which brings us nicely to Act 2, the Australian bounty.
To really grasp the magnitude of the choice they made next, just look at this number, 12,000 miles. Seeking a better life for themselves and their infant daughter Elizabeth, this couple took an absolute leap of faith. Britain was actually actively encouraging the settlement of New South Wales at the time through a bounty scheme. They were essentially subsidizing the passage for skilled workers. And since Alexander was a sawyer, he was the perfect candidate. So, in 1840, they board the sailing ship Brothers in Liverpool, setting off to travel all the way around the Cape of Good Hope. And guys, this was incredibly dangerous. In fact, while the ship was stopped at the Cape, a literal mutiny broke out. The seamen straight up refused to work and demanded better conditions. Can you even imagine being huddled down in the dark hold of a ship with a tiny baby while the crew above is being placed in irons? It's a really stark reminder of just how raw and perilous maritime travel was in the age of sail.
But against all odds, they made it. They arrived in Sydney in March 1841. And once they were there, Alexander completely capitalized on the booming colonial economy. The guy climbed the social ladder impressively fast. He went from being a humble sawyer to entering a business partnership, and by 1848, he was a prosperous publican. He was literally running a busy pub right out of their home on Sussex Street. Sydney back then was absolutely packed with laborers, sailors, and traders, which made the pub trade incredibly lucrative. For a brief moment, it really seemed like they had found their happily ever after.
But then, you look at this table showing the fates of their children, and it reveals the heartbreaking reality of 19th century child mortality, even in a relatively prosperous, upwardly mobile household like theirs. During their years in Sydney, the family definitely grew. But while Elizabeth, Joseph, and Jane survived, 3 of their other children, William, John, and Margaret, tragically died in infancy or early childhood. It's just a sobering, grounding reminder of the constant shadow of grief that families back then had to live under.
And then, the world shifts underneath them all over again. In 1848, gold is discovered in California. The news eventually reaches Sydney, and a total frenzy ensues. In August 1849, Alexander just succumbs to the lure of the gold rush. He sells off his timberyard equipment, hops on a ship, and sails for California, leaving Rachel behind to manage his affairs. But here is where the legal system of the time absolutely traps her. In May 1850, Rachel applied for a publican's license to just run the pub in her own name, and she was denied. Why? On a legal technicality. Under the incredibly restrictive coverture laws of that era, a wife couldn't enter into the necessary legal business agreements while her husband was presumed to be alive. So think about her situation. Her husband has vanished across the ocean. She is legally barred from making her own livelihood, and in that very same month, she has to bury her infant daughter, Margaret. It leaves us with this massive, hanging question. Widowed in all but name, what does a mother of three do next?
And that cliffhanger drags us right into Act 3, the California tragedy.
Things unraveled incredibly fast once their journey collided head-on with the chaotic, dangerous frontier of the American West. Just look at this timeline. 1848, gold is discovered in California. 1849, Alexander leaves Sydney. By 1850, Rachel loses her business, buries her daughter, and makes this desperate, undocumented ocean crossing across the entire Pacific to San Francisco with her 3 surviving kids. And by 1853, Alexander meets a tragic end. Let's zoom in on what actually happened once they hit American soil.
San Francisco in 1851 was arguably one of the most turbulent, lawless cities on the face of the earth. It was a raucous boomtown, swelling with tens of thousands of people. Rachel, newly arrived and totally alone with 3 young children, miraculously managed to survive by running a boarding house. But it was far from easy. Newspaper records from November 1851 show she was actually robbed while asleep in her own home. Her own boarders literally entered her room and stole a diamond ring and $54 right out of her dress. The sheer grit and resilience it took for her to just keep her kids alive in that kind of environment is honestly astounding.
Meanwhile, Alexander's grand gold rush dreams ended in absolute despair. He never struck it rich, not even close. He made his way to Angel's Camp in the Motherlode country, and in May 1853, at just 35 years old, Alexander committed suicide by 6 Mile Creek. Now, there's a harsh 1853 newspaper excerpt about this that chillingly attributes his suicide directly to, quote, an absconding wife and liquor. We actually have no idea whether Alexander and Rachel ever even saw each other again in California, and that term absconding is almost certainly a highly skewed, unverified take on a wife who was literally just trying to survive after being abandoned in Sydney. But regardless of the paper's spin, his death was a lonely, tragic end to his immense ambition.
From there, Rachel's final chapter was brutally limited by her circumstances. Without a husband's legal protection in the mid-19th century, a woman's options just completely dwindled. She did have a brief second marriage in 1854 to a man named Thomas Spencer, and bizarrely enough, this was one of the men who had actually been accused, though acquitted, of robbing her back in 1851. Talk about a wild twist. But he died just 4 years later. By the late 1850s, Rachel had moved to Sacramento, and the records show a really steep decline. She was arrested in 1859 for using obscene and vulgar language on a public street, which was highly indicative of inebriation back then. Finally, she passed away in 1861 at the young age of just 42. The official mortuary record lists her cause of death simply as intemperance. Worn down by years of displacement, trauma, and hardship, she outlived Alexander by only 8 years.
But wait, that's not where this ends. Let's look at our epilogue, an enduring Western legacy.
Because, despite the immense tragedy that consumed both Alexander and Rachel in the end, the outcome for their family lineage was actually incredible. All that sacrifice, that endless brutal traveling, it definitely wasn't for nothing. Their 3 surviving children, Elizabeth, Joseph, and Jane, planted deep, enduring roots right there in the California gold country. Elizabeth was married twice and had 13 kids. Joseph settled right down in Angel's Camp, the very same town where his father died, and he had 9 kids. Jane married and had 11. Ultimately, Alexander and Rachel produced an absolutely astounding 33 grandchildren. And those grandchildren carried the Whittle family line well into the 20th century, spreading all across Calaveras, Tuolumne, and San Francisco counties.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a provocative thought to chew on. How do the extraordinary journeys of ordinary people help us understand the macro-historical forces that built our modern world? You see, the heartbreaking but incredibly resilient micro-history of the Whittles completely changes how we look at textbook events like the Industrial Revolution or global migration.
It puts a real, breathing human face on these giant abstract concepts like bounty immigration or the California gold rush. It shows us the immense courage, the devastating legal barriers that women faced, and the absolute sheer grit required by everyday people to literally build the world we live in today. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey, and I'll see you next time.